Hello and what is up? It's your boy Real_Joshua, and today we have a very special collaboration with Kai. As many of you may know, Japan is the place where the One Piece card game was born. It's where the meta develops, and Kai may be the only Japanese content creator who lives in Japan, has pro-level knowledge and access to players and competitions, and speaks native level English. A few days ago, I sat down with Kai to talk about the state of the Japanese metagame, and more importantly, what it is like to actually play the One Piece card game in Japan. Even looking through YouTube, it's kind of hard to get access into what the Japanese card game scene looks like. This was my chance to talk with Kai about all the burning questions that I had about the game and some of the juicier topics like West versus East, which is better. Before we get into that, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you have not already, and check out my Patreon and Discord down in the description below. Without further ado, let's get right into the interview. Kai, I have obviously been wanting to collab with you for a minute, and I was thinking of all these things to do. First off, why don't you introduce yourself really quickly, and how did you get into the One Piece card game, etc, etc.
First of all, thanks for having me. I really enjoy your channel as well, so I'm glad that we can have this finally. So my name is Kai. I started playing the One Piece card game exactly on release day because release day was actually my girlfriend's birthday. And she's the One Piece fan. I had never read it before, and she wanted to kind of try buying the cards just because it happened to come out on her birthday, which was fun. My initial goal was I wanted to get a nice collection together for her, but there's prize cards in tournaments, and I was like, well, if I want those cards, I need to enter tournaments, and then that's how I ended up playing the game. So before then, I really hadn't played card games competitively. I'd play Legends of Runeterra a little bit, Hearthstone here and there, just for fun, casually, but never at a competitive level. But this game, I thought maybe I'd try doing that, and somehow 2 years later, I'm making content for it. That's kind of how it all started, but partway through, I guess, I was writing articles and stuff, and that's kind of where a lot of people know me originally. I was writing articles with Cross AI on his Patreon, just random guides on things like Green Uta, Green Kid, a lot of interesting decks that are coming out. And because I have this sort of information advantage, being kind of 3 months ahead, I was able to write those so some people knew me. So when I started YouTube, I kind of did the same thing and it worked out.
I want to get into some of the juicier conversations, Western format versus Eastern. But I want to start off with more of just the overarching concepts of how the scene works over there, right? Because you talked about Hearthstone and Legends of Runeterra. I didn't even think they were very big in Japan. Was that kind of an anomaly that you were into it? Is that kind of a small thing, or?
I think that Legends of Runeterra is really not that big in Japan. It was more just my COVID era. I didn't really have anything to do, and I found the card game and it was fun. But Hearthstone, there is a decent number of players in Japan. But again, mostly, I think it's just because if you play a digital card game, it would probably be Hearthstone, at least especially around that time, because I was playing in the early sets of Hearthstone. It's not necessarily that the scene is big, it's just that if you want to play a digital card game, those are kind of the go-to choices, and Legend of Runeterra is just kind of because I already knew the League of Legends IP.
How popular is a One Piece card game in Japan? Because that's actually how I got into it. Was I was in Japan. I was just getting into the One Piece anime, and I was a big card game guy. And I saw the One Piece card game. It hadn't even come out in the West yet, and it seemed really popular to me. I was seeing it everywhere, but I mean, obviously it's because I'm paying attention to it because I like card games, and I was liking One Piece at the time. But how big would you say it is over there? And on top of that, what kind of people typically play it?
It's hard to say how big it is, just because when you're actually in the sphere, it feels bigger than it actually is. Compared to people who are really into idol groups, for example. Idols will have millions of fans, but then in card games, even a tournament with a couple thousand people feels huge. So the scale is a bit different. But in terms of comparing the One Piece card game to other card games, I think that One Piece is pretty confidently number 3, maybe number 2. I just don't know how many Yu-Gi-Oh players still are there. But Magic the Gathering's not very big in Japan for one reason or another. And One Piece card game, I imagine they're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the tournament structure in Japan, you effectively need to go through regional tournaments to actually try to qualify for nationals. You can't just apply to nationals. And the regional tournaments, they try to get in a decent number of people, but you need to qualify for those as well. And despite needing to qualify for the regionals, about 10,000 people over the course of one wave will end up playing. So the game is very big because it will fill up.
I think just as far as sales figures are concerned, compared to other card games, it seems like number 3 is pretty big for especially how not long One Piece has been around the card game. What about the types of people that you see playing the card game? Like, what is the scene like over there?
Right. I think, especially in Tokyo, because of how dense Tokyo is, the community is also very dense. Like, one thing that I notice, at least from overseas, and maybe you can kind of shine some light on this, is that locals seem to have the same types of, or like the same people basically every week. Whereas in Japan, even if I go to the same locals every week, I might recognize one person over the course of several weeks. There's so many different people playing, but I guess the types of people who are playing kind of come down to a few things. There's very casual people who will play the decks or the characters they like just because of how strong the One Piece IP is. And there's also very competitive players who, back in OP05, they'll say they really like playing Luffy, so they want to play Purple Luffy, but then they open up their deck and then it's Magellan and, Water 7 characters. This is not the Straw Hats that I knew. But I really think that because of how powerful the IP is, you also get these people who just play it for the passion of the character, which is fun as well. But despite me saying that, they are still really good at the game. So I think that is one big difference, because we're in such a tight-knit community in Tokyo that everyone just ends up being a lot better at the game by playing against good players.
What is the density of card shops there? Like, how many card shops have One Piece locals? And do you find yourself kind of hopping between them all the time? Or is there one that you will go to all the time? Especially since you say you're seeing different people every time. Does that mean that you are frequenting one place when you go to locals? Or do you have just like a massive variety of options available to you at any given time?
Let's just say that if I walk 20 minutes, I can get to 7 card shops. So
okay.
That is something to do with my location, that there just happens to be a couple of card shops around here. But there are a lot of locals. The one issue is that they're all on the weekend. So it's not like I can cleanly go to like Monday, Wednesday, Thursday or something. But there's, for example, Akihabara is the center of all things, like otaku, anime, these kinds of things. There's also a ton of card shops there. And there's probably like at least 50 card shops, because this one building would have like 6 card shops in it. So there is just a ton of card shops, and as long as they have some space that you can sit down, even 8 seats, they'll have locals. So you're spoiled for choice, which is why you end up seeing so many people, because people don't decide based on location, they decide based on the time. And if they happen to be free, for example, on Sunday from 3 p.m., there will be a local somewhere in Tokyo.
Not that you have stats on this, obviously, but just from like observation, somebody who's played the card game for a while, what would you say the spread of like men to women is typically? And then just like, is it mostly people who are like nerdy, or is that separation even there? Is it just like a normal side hobby to play a card game in Japan? Because I feel like here it's super, super niche.
Well, first of all, the number of girls playing, I think that it's probably about 5%, which is less than Pokemon, because when I see Pokemon locals or something, when you just pass by a card shop, it'll be maybe like 10 to 15% women playing. But One Piece, maybe a little bit less, but still most people who do play just really like the IP, and the IP is very universal from boy to girl. It's just that card games as a niche is a more boy-focused niche, I guess. And then the types of people playing, I don't really get the sense that they're nerdy. Some people are very antisocial, which I guess is kind of a trait of being focused on this niche. But a lot of the people just seem like very normal office workers, and then on their free time, they just go and play card games.
Yeah, that seems relatively consistent with how I would put it into words for here. What is it actually like to go to locals over there? My experience here, it'll happen during the week or on the weekend. You go in, they take your little Bandai TCG Plus app thing, and then you just play like 4 or 5 games, and that's it. And the format is typically what you would experience in like a big tournament, right? It's like 1v1 normal format. Is that how it typically goes over there as well, or are there any like big differences?
You guys need to apply ahead of time, right? Or do you not need to?
You don't need to, but yeah, in some cases they prefer that you do.
I see. At least in Tokyo, if you don't apply ahead of time, you won't end up being able to get in just because the spots will fill up. Like, let me just scroll. So, I mean, I'll put this up to the camera. Okay, I just counted, and there are 20 locals that are happening today from the span of 11:30 start to 8 p.m. start, 8:30. And so if I were to just click on one random one and scroll down, there are 32 spots and like 64 people have applied for it. So it ends up being that if you do want to go to these tournaments, you do kind of need to prepare ahead of time. Although you can, of course, cancel before you go to give people who are on the wait list to go in. But that's the first difference, I guess, that I notice, is that you do kind of need to prepare a bit more just because of the number of people who want to play the game. But the other thing is that in Japan, a lot of card shops don't require an entrance fee for these kinds of locals. So it's much more casual feeling, I would imagine. Because I went to a European locals once, and it felt a bit more serious, I guess was the right word. So it's a bit interesting. It's I can only speak.
What is the pricing like?
It's actually, I think it's the same. We don't have the 4 different winner cards that you guys have. We have one winner card, and then we have a participation pack. And I always wonder how stores actually make money on like $0 entrance fee. But I mean, that's just kind of a thing that's normalized here.
It's just marketing for over there, I suppose. That is definitely a lot different. Okay, now let's get into some topics that are a little bit more hot takey. When I was first starting to get into content creation and, really getting into it around OP07, I would look at a lot of the note guides, the Japanese guides, and I noticed that a lot of the advice was it was inconsistent. Like if I was looking at 3 different guides, they might give 3 different things of advice. And then sometimes it felt like a little bit dated, or I don't know if I really trust it, because the builds over there that I would see were just so much different than the ones that I was seeing here. I was playing RP Law at the time, and even the builds that I was seeing were quite a bit different from where they were in the West, at least how we were seeing it. And I've kind of noticed this as a consistent thing when I look at deck builds from Japan, and then I look at deck builds, in the West. I was talking to Jansuko about this at Bandai Card Fest in Orlando, and he was immediately Japan, they suck. They haven't had that much time to cook up new ways of going, and their deck builds are sus, blah, blah, blah. And obviously it was more nuanced than that. I'm just kind of boiling it down. Sorry, Jansuko, for a potential misrepresentation of what you're saying. But he was kind of negative on, the meta that comes to us from Japan. But I feel like it stands to reason that Japan would not have a fully developed meta, because you only get a couple months with a set before it moves on. We effectively get 3 more months because we see how your metagame develops. Some people just play the Japanese meta because we have access to the sim over here. But do you think that there's an extent to which Japan is kind of at a disadvantage competitively compared to how we might have it in the West?
While you're saying that, I thought of 2 answers. I can only think of one right now, but I'll say I think there's 2 answers, and then maybe I'll remember the other one while I'm talking. But okay. I think that one thing that really hurts Japan is the tournament system, because we only have 2 waves, and each wave is 6 to 8 weeks in a row of tournaments. What ends up happening is that we only have championships once every 2 sets. So, for example, I didn't have any tournaments at all in OP10, so there's no reason for me to really perfect a deck. When it's championship season, I think that the decks get really refined because people are trying to go for the top. And then you get some really interesting things, even within the really small amount of time we had, Green Purple Luffy has changed a lot from week 1 to week 2, where we end up having the Japan finals. And if we don't have tournaments, then the only tournaments that exist are flagships. And that was the other thing I wanted to talk about. Flagships are effectively local level tournaments in terms of the number of people playing, with really good pricing. But obviously, the one stipulation is that I think that the average skill level in Japan is really high. So it's not going to be your average, I'm trying to think of a location that wouldn't offend anyone, but I won't. But let's say average Timbuktu locals compared to Tokyo is very different. So then what ends up happening with Note is that if you win a flagship battle, although you only end up winning 5 rounds, which is just effectively a locals. A lot of people turn that into guides because a lot of people want to win a flagship, and then if they see someone who won a flagship, then they're like, oh, if I buy this note and read it, then maybe I can win a flagship. And vice versa, people who end up winning a flagship, they see other people writing guides on their flagship wins, and they're like, I can make a quick buck doing this. And the variability of the quality of the note will a lot of the time come down to the player. So if I do buy a note, I try to generally only buy from players that I actually know or did really well in the tournament. But it's because of the flagship system that we have something that's kind of in between locals and championships, which is still something that people will try to do well in. But the meta is very different because you only have to win 5 rounds compared to winning like 13 rounds.
That's so interesting to me, like how, because, you know, obviously we have treasure cups, we have regionals, but those do feel on average bigger than what you're talking about with the flagships here, because these are 8-9 round things as opposed to 5, which is like such an interesting middle ground. And so I could see metas kind of developing differently around that. But so you're saying that there's like, at times there's just flagship and then championship. That's like the gulf between the two?
It's if you want to talk about the seriousness of tournaments, there's like I think my friend was calling it like a pirate party or something, like a very casual level event. And then there's locals, and then there's flagship battles, and then in terms of official tournaments, it jumps straight up to the 1,000-player championships. So there's no in-between between 32 people and 1,000, unless you go to unofficial tournaments, which there are a lot of. But unofficial tournaments are actually extremely competitive because although there's only going to be like 100 people at them, the people who actually apply to them are very high-level players. So what ends up happening is that the top cut of those unofficial tournaments is just as hard as the top cut of like an 1,000-player tournament, but they're not regarded the same just because they're only like 100 people and it's unofficial. So I think that if you actually want to make something in between, then those do exist, and there are a lot of them that happen constantly, especially around Tokyo. But in terms of official tournaments, we really don't have much between flagships and massive regional events that you first need to even qualify to get into. A lot of people say that flagship system is unfair is maybe not the right word, but a lot of people wish they had the flagship system overseas. And I wish that I had the Treasure Cup online regionals system over here. If I could choose between having flagships or those types of Treasure Cups and whatnot, I would choose the Treasure Cups. I just think that, especially in Japan, you can only maybe get into 1 flagship per month if you're lucky. I would rather get into 1 Treasure Cup per month and try my luck at a much bigger event, because those seem more interesting than just a random locals where you might not even get anything if you just do like slightly bad in the early rounds.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if we could do both, but it seems like they're both compromises to an extent. Another thing, it seems like to me that Japan sometimes seems to underrepresent some of the strong decks that we see here, or at least what we interpret to be strong. I think that the example that comes to mind to me right now is BY Luffy, just because that's kind of the most obvious one at the moment, where, you know, Cross was able to win Nats with that, and it's still seen as a huge threat in the OP09 meta. But as far as I understand, in Japan, it didn't really have that reputation because I think it was interpreted that a lot of decks just beat it, like Goldie Roger just beats it. Lucci wasn't as popular. A lot of the prevalent decks just beat it. Do you think that there is a reason why this is the case, that, like, you know, sometimes these decks might go under the radar? Do you think it's because the US has more time to kind of sit with these and cook, as it were? Or do you think it's something that Japan is missing or has missed, or is the West just like not very good at adjusting to get around BY Luffy as well as Japan was able to?
I think there's a couple of interesting things that I can say about that. Hold on, let me figure out how to.
Yeah, these are kind of like loaded questions, so take your time.
We don't have official stats from Bandai, of course, on the play rate of decks, but from all of the data that I've been able to aggregate and look at, the very first OP09 championship in Japan, Black Yellow Luffy was the most played deck. And I think that what ends up happening is that when the West gets the meta, they effectively look at our meta as a whole and then choose a starting point. Whereas Japan basically starts, for example, OP09 has to start with OP08. And in OP08, Black Yellow Luffy was strong. So then people will play Black Yellow Luffy into OP09, and then people adapt to that meta. And the adaptation was to play Teach. And I think that because of Black Yellow Luffy being really powerful at the start of OP09 in Japan, which I think a lot of people forget, people end up playing Teach. And then Teach ended up having a really high presence throughout the whole of OP09. And I think that that's due to the way that it started. Whereas in the West, because you start with some people already wanting to play Teach, some people wanting to play some other random decks, that it ends up being, like Lucci, for example, that Black Yellow Luffy is a good response to that meta. So I think that it's because you guys get a small meta reset, and you can actually look at the meta holistically, that you end up having different responses to the meta, because the starting meta is very different. You're starting from our 3-month point, whereas we're starting from the 0-month point.
Exactly, because I mean, we had other adjustments going into the start of our OP09 as well, which was like our interpretation was that Dofi is unbelievably strong, which makes Teach less popular, which then makes BY Luffy more of a threat. And it's just everything kind of warps around what our interpretation of that is. And even to Japan's credit, in the beginning of OP09, cross bringing BY Luffy to Nats was a risk, like a huge risk for him. You know, nobody expected it to do that well because people were expecting Teach to be around and Dofi, which are decks that are said to be able to beat BY Luffy fairly handily, but it worked out for him. So it wasn't like a sure thing by any stretch.
Yeah, I think one thing that you guys have some trouble with is predicting how the meta is going to end up being, because even for me, at least, I can kind of get a gauge for what people want to play from my own comments section. And before OP09 dropped, a lot of people were really hyped for Teach, but it seems like once the set actually dropped, people didn't end up playing it. And it's hard to read how popular deck's actually going to end up being, regardless of the skill level, or regardless of the power of the deck, I mean. Because Shanks, for example, maybe hot take, I don't think is that strong. It has a very high player base, but the results that it leave is next to nothing. But despite that, a lot of people play it just because it's very simple, it feels cool to play Shanks, and the IP, you know, a lot of people just want to play Shanks. So despite it being maybe B tier, it's played to the level of it being like a high A tier deck, or in terms of play rate.
Which leads us into the next question that I had was, and this is, I think it's a problem everywhere. People like to play the play styles that they dig, or the characters that they like from the show. Purposefully TCG, aka Taylor, I think a mutual friend of ours, he's been playing Purple Luffy this whole set, despite like having so many bad things to say about it, not having great results, and feeling like the deck is kind of holding him back to an extent. Do you think that this is something that happens a lot in Japan? Do the best players over there tend to kind of stick with their pet decks, or are the top players always just jumping to whatever the top S tier meta deck is at the time?
I think that very, very top players will end up having to just keep jumping to whatever the best meta deck is, or the best meta response if they believe in that. But everything that's not top level player, or like world class player, I guess, people end up kind of playing what they're most comfortable with. Like in my last video that I uploaded yesterday at the time of recording this, was the OP10 Nationals, and to qualify for Nationals you have to get through the regional events, and most people looking through their Twitter profiles ended up playing the same deck that they brought to regionals to Nationals. And despite the meta being slightly different, some people change a couple of cards within their deck. Most people would bring the same deck. My friend, who ended up not doing too well in the national tournaments, but he did qualify for it, played Bonnie in both of them. And obviously, Bonnie, in terms of tier list, does really bad into Teach, and also Black Lucci, but does well into Purple Luffy, and can maybe fight with Doflamingo depending on how you build the deck. Despite those weaknesses of the deck, he still brought it just because he really likes the deck, and I think that he's a very strong player. So I do think that that exists within Japan as well.
I felt like last set, like OP08 for us, it felt like Lucci and BY Luffy were just like the best decks, and I felt like I did not see them represented as much in Japan. Like, how come more people aren't playing Lucci over there? Like, oh, I can't even really speak to this when it comes to Japan because you guys had RP Law. So that I think that was like a huge schism in that meta game. So probably not even worth bringing up here. But I feel like I have seen instances where I'm like, why isn't this insane deck that is like destroying our meta over here right now? How come we didn't see that in Japan as much? And I think it's just for the reasons that we had kind of talked about, which is that we get these metas at a different time. And I think if the roles were reversed and we had the meta 3 months in advance, you guys would have it in the same way too. Do you have access to the sim over there? Do people play the game in the sim?
I think most people do play it, but it doesn't feel as widespread as it does in the West. Like, people casually talk about the sim, and everyone would know what the sim is in Japan if you talk about it on Twitter, for example. But I think that a lot of people don't really treat sim results as actual results, and people never post their testing results from the sim, so it feels more like a thing that you do on your personal time, I guess, in Japan.
How do people mostly practice through locals, or is it like that plus sim, or is it mostly locals plus playing other people in person?
I think most of the time people end up just playing each other in person, whether it's remotely through webcam or meeting physically. Although it's a bit of a pain, I think that it's just that a lot of people prefer to actually play with the physical cards, and if you have them, you kind of want to use them. So the remote play culture feels a bit bigger than the sim, but because the sim is something you could easily do on your own, I imagine the player base is still higher. People just don't talk about it as much. The question that you had before about Lucci and OP08, we kind of like jumped off of that a bit quickly. I do think there is something kind of interesting that you could say about that in a Japanese play.
Yeah.
Is that OP08, obviously we had Red Purple Law, and I think Red Purple Law was banned at the end of OP08, so we never really had a timing where Black Yellow Luffy and Lucci could really be the dominant decks. So I think that just because we never had that meta where they were really powerful, we don't have that meta in OP09 as well. So I think a lot of it is due to the fact that we had the most disgusting deck in the game ever, Red Purple Law, for so long that we ended up skipping out on that. However, despite that, in terms of results, Lucci ended up leaving the second most results. I don't know where Black Yellow Luffy places in that. But the two most dominant decks at the time were Lucci and Red Purple Law. I think it's just that people forget about everything that's not Red Purple Law.
And we never had Red Purple Law. So like, I don't think RP Law was ever OP in the Western format.
Black Maria ruined that deck.
Exactly. And it's a bummer.
Nightmare.
Gotta love the design of just putting out a card that breaks the deck or a starter deck that breaks the deck. And in the case of Dofi, and then people are like, oh yeah, it's totally understandable if they banned it. I want to talk about 3v3 as a format because I don't feel like I see that anywhere in the West, but I see all these videos online in Japan, and it seems to be like a fairly common format. Is that a thing over there?
I think even for me as well, 3v3s are the most fun formats because there isn't the pressure of if you lose, you're out, because you still have people next to you. And likewise, if your team loses, they're not out either. If you all lose together, then it wasn't meant to be. So most people just prefer that format in general. And if we kind of go onto the back end a bit from someone trying to put together tournaments, a lot of people will end up canceling on unofficial tournaments because of like whatever on-day plans that they ended up having. But 3v3, it's much harder to cancel because if you cancel, then you're canceling on two other people who do want to go. So the turnout rate in unofficial tournaments is also much higher for 3v3s, which is why in unofficial tournaments, you see a lot of 3v3s.
That makes sense. And I wonder why we don't adopt more 3v3. Maybe it's harder to get 3 friends who play One Piece here.
I'm sure that you guys can. I find it really weird that you guys don't have it because it's like by far the most popular format in Japan, I would imagine.
It seems like so much fun. Like when you describe it that way, I'm like, yeah, I want to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's really simple too. Like, there's a lot of interesting things that you can do from a deck choice perspective because you can't use leaders with the same color, which means that you can't have Black Teach and Black Lucci on the same team. And in OP10, both of these decks are quite relevant. So what that means is that you don't have to worry about hitting them because you're only going to hit like what is it? you can bring a deck that has an extremely bad Doflamingo matchup, but you'll never hit it more than 33% of the time on average, because only one player can play Doflamingo. And then likewise, you can bring a deck that's really bad into Teach and Lucci, but you still only have a 33% chance of hitting it if they actually bring it, because they can only bring one of the two. So the deck choice perspective also changes a lot with 3v3s, and that's what I find really interesting, is choosing 3 decks that aren't just the most powerful decks, but work well as a team.
Yeah, that's so much more compelling in a lot of ways, but good. Yeah, good for you. Good for you guys. Maybe someday we'll get that.
It's the one thing we have over you guys, aside from flagships.
The final thing, and this is probably more suited for the beginning of our chat. It's kind of in that vein, but what's the cost of entry? Like, US has gotten way better with this. When I started, the game was unbelievably expensive, and now it's a bit more acceptable, I think. But it seems like in Japan, like overall, the price of building a One Piece deck is much lower. Does that seem to be the case, or is this really like a luxury hobby over there too?
It's very easy to make a deck. If you give me any random card that exists in English, I can tell you how much it costs in Japanese. I'm pretty sure most of our cards are at least half the price of yours. Especially alt arts are probably like several times cheaper, I would imagine. Oh,
Secret Rare Rayleigh.
The Rayleigh, if you're in America, right?
Yeah.
If you make it like USD, it's probably like $15. Which is on the expensive side for cards.
Yeah, it's like 40 here. But granted, it might be more relevant right now, but
I mean, it was like at its peak, it was like 20.
Okay, yeah, never mind.
Like it's come down a little bit because people haven't really been playing Shanks as much. But the highest I've ever seen a secret rare is right now with the secret rare Luffy from EB02. That card's about 3,800 yen, which is a little bit less than $30, and like maybe 25-ish to 28 maybe, I would imagine. And that's like absurdly expensive for a card in Japan. I don't think we've ever had a secret rare that's that expensive before.
It just makes me wonder, like, how different the game would be if the cards were, you know, around that price as opposed to what they actually are here. I think that's what is cool about this conversation, is that these are all things like we don't have this perspective here. Like I did not realize a lot of the things that you're saying. So I'm glad I was able to ask.
Adding on to the last thing, the very top card on my pile is the 3-cost Tashigi. And this card is about $3 and I don't want to buy it. I only have 2 right now. To make it 4 would cost me $6. And I'm like, oh, that's so expensive, I don't want to buy it. So most SRs in Japan you could buy for about $1 to $2. So bit of perspective.
Wait, I did have one more question. Sorry. How do Japanese people view the meta in other regions? Like, do they ever take inspiration from the decks that we make here? Or do they mostly just like not care about what's happening in other regions because we're all behind?
I think this is from the perspective of someone who has a lot of close connection, especially to the NA community, where I talk constantly with Jonas and Jackson and, you know, Chris Sock, all of these really high level players, that they take a lot of inspiration from Japan, but I've almost never seen Japanese players take inspiration from them. Like Black Yellow Luffy, until a couple of weeks ago, was still running the 5-cost Ace and not running, it still doesn't run any of those random black cards like the 3-cost Nami, the 4-cost Shiraoshi. None of these cards exist in Japanese lists, and I don't really know why.
You should. Do you think if you were to bring those to like a local and just, it would be like, you know, you created some insane new sauce or something?
So that happened before. Like, were you playing in OP05?
No.
Okay.
That was right before I started.
Okay. OP05 Sakazuki meta. Japan was running the more standard at the end of OP05 list, where the highest top end that you have is the 7-cost Porcelino. And you play very technically and small with things like Hound Blaze, and closing out the game with 7-cost Porcelino and Rebecca Hinauchi. And Southeast Asia was running 10-cost Kaido that draws 4 cards in their decks. And I was like, oh, that looks fun. So I put in 10-cost Kaido into my deck. Every single person that I played it on, they're like, what is this card? And I'm like, and I'm saying like, oh, it's my tech. but I just stole it from Southeast Asia. And
Wow.
it did really well. And also at the World Championship, this is just what I've heard from Jackson, is that round one he went against one of Japan's like highest level players. I think he had until recently a track record of topping every single event that he's ever been to. And he like fumbled the last one that he went to. And Jackson hit him in round one, and they were playing a Sakazuki mirror. And Jackson played Tenkasu Kaido on Tendong, and it completely ruined his game plan because he didn't have a way to deal with it. And we've talked about this where like if he even knew that the card existed, then he could change the way that he plays his turn before to make his board bigger, to make it much harder to play Tenkasu Kaido. But I feel like people just don't really do research on the meta. So they end up getting surprised by these random tech cards that have been added to improve upon the deck list that we've kind of set as a standard. But then because there's no reason for us to go back to other metas, we don't really look at them, which is why I really want simultaneous release.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's, for me, I see like, oh, well, there's a lot of Shanks lists that had taken inspiration from, you know, the Latin American lists and stuff like that. So there is a lot of exchange internationally, but it's not like the US, it's not like we're looking at the Korean meta and saying, oh my gosh, they're running this crazy sauce in Zoro 5 sets ago. Like maybe that we could use that to improve how we play Zoro right now. But I do think in the future, like that kind of stuff could be interesting to look at. Like maybe I should be looking at the Korean meta more or something. I don't know.
There was I'm sorry I forgot his name, but a Lucci player in NA that topped nationals. He got like maybe top 8 or something. He put out like a really nice free Metafy article. And I read through that, put together Lucci kind of inspired by the things that he wrote down, how he's talking about things like Tukasu Uta and how it's really good into certain matchups that I was seeing more often than he was seeing in his meta. And although I didn't have much time to test it, the Tukasu Uta, no one plays it in Japan, but it did really well when I tried it. So there's these sorts of things where I think that there is a lot of room to look back and see what people are optimizing to try to play that in Japan. But because most of it is just slop, I guess, where it is just kind of the same decks that we have, or the meta's so different that it's hard to say if that deck would actually do well, that it's hard to actually try to look back and analyze it, especially because if you're in the Japanese Twitter bubble, it's hard to reach the NA Twitter bubble.
The language barrier is just massive, and that's why it's good to have, you know, channels like yours to help kind of break that down a bit. So yeah, I think that'll do it for me. But yeah, do you want to plug your stuff? Let people know where to find you.
You can find me at iKaikai on most platforms, YouTube, Twitter. That's by skill I do, but I do randomly have other things like Twitch that I have not used yet. I make videos on Japanese meta, occasionally try to do some kind of gameplay videos when something's fun. I'm going to be playing lots of Blue Purple Luffy when OP11 comes out, and I hope to see you guys on my channel. Shout out to Joshua for having me on his channel, and thank you for having me.
Again, thank you so much to iKaiLakai for talking with me. It was a great discussion. I hope to collab more in the future, maybe on some gameplay videos, maybe on some meta discussions, maybe on some other topics. Let me know what kinds of collabs you would like to see between me and Kai, and thank you so much again for watching. It's your boy Real_Joshua. Find me on Twitch at Real_Joshua, and I am also on Twitter at Hi There Josh. Anyway, see you in the next one. Later.